Well, thanks for coming here today, Patrick.
No, I'm delighted.
I've been doing things on and off with the Swedenborg Society for about 5-6 years, and it's a lovely place to work with because although one doesn't have to be a Swedenborgian, it's become quite a centre for kind of the discussion of ideas or the interface between the arts, philosophy, spirituality and so on. Strangely, I think, and the more I've kind of researched into various aspects of kind of urban dissent, nonconformism, rural cultures, this kind of the accretion of very strange ideas from other countries, other religions is very strong. And I think in a way Swedenborgism having quite a lot in common in some ways with theosophy, which kind of swept Europe at the beginning of the 20th century.
And was around at the beginning of the Labour Party. And it's an interesting line.
Yeah. I think the other thing is, of course, we've known each other for nearly 40 years, I think. And some people actually, I remember once, I tried to get an agent. I've never had an agent. And I approached this guy, and he took me out for lunch, and he said something like, well, you're not Patrick Wright and you're not Ian Sinclair, and I'm not sure I can do anything with you.
I've had 3 agents and it never worked out.
But the thing is, I think, strangely, we've also crossed paths, not simply socially, but you've been in Dalston researching the changes in the 70s.
Yeah, but you were there first, Ken.
Yeah, well, I was there first in Jewish East End, the work of Alexander Barron. But I think we both really understand that place is central to any understanding of human activity.
I think also we're interested in what I think can be called the S-exodus.
Yes.
The movement out.
Yes.
From the east of the city, both into Kent and into Essex.
Yeah. And I always remember something you said about too many books and too many academics. They're going out there to the archives looking for stuff that fits what they want to say, whereas you, I think, and I hope, we go to the archives and we think, well, what are these archives telling us? I hadn't thought about, this is unusual, something is happening that you didn't anticipate. And it is the kind of respect for the material, isn't it?
Well, you've got a lovely quote at the beginning of that book, somebody talking about Simone Weil.
Oh, yes.
And what she says writing is.
Yes.
And she describes it as attention.
Yeah.
Now, it's I read that with great interest because my German writer in my book, Uwe Johnson, he said to write is to be involved in an act of reconnaissance.
Yeah.
It's about finding out. Neither of these ideas of writing are about elaborating a line that you've already figured out.
No.
And that's what too much academic writing is.
Yeah.
And it's what too much journalism is too.
And it's why, if you're going to go to Dorset as you have, or to Sheerness on the Isle of Sheppey, or I've gone to rural Essex, or to Canvey Island, or to Jewish East End of London, we're looking at cultures and peoples and ideas and books that are kind of offbeat, or they're not coming through the mainstream. And I think, in a way, to use a very contemporary phrase, we're looking at people and ideas and movements that do not conform to capitalist realism. They're all struggling against...
Yeah, and they also very often provide a kind of devious route into the centre. So although you pick up the thread way out there, you find the centre is, you pull at it and the centre looks quite different.
Yeah.
You're seeing different things about the centre. So I completely agree with you. I think this process of finding out, I've always thought as a writer what you should do is you should leave things more interesting than you found them before you set to work properly. So you're always trying to thicken up reality and to provide a clearer sense of what its possibilities have been.
Yeah.
And I think you talked about capitalist realism, and this is sort of Mark Fisher's idea that the future is ruined because it's been defeated. Yeah. It's whenever it appears, it sort of is destroyed by this infernal logic everywhere. So in a sense, you're looking for the future that has already disintegrated into the past.
Yeah.
So there's lots of elements to this which we do share.
Yeah. And strangely, of course, the title of my book is taken from a Lawrence quote, after the devastation of the First World War, that we've got to start again and we've got to do things differently, no matter how many skies have fallen. Can I ask you, I mean, it was amazing when this book arrived, weighing down a man from one of the courier companies. Your book about Uwe Johnson and Sheerness.
The Sea View, yes.
The Sea View has me again. I mean, I was expecting... I had read Uwe Johnson in the 70s, because strangely, I'd gone to a conference in mid-70s, organised by the German department at Birmingham University, where some members of Group 49 turned up from Germany. He wasn't one of them. But I only read one novel and then forgot completely about him, and I think that's probably not unusual for people.
No, it's true. I mean, he was published in translation by Penguin in the late 60s and early 70s.
Yeah.
3 novels, really, and another sort of long text, long short story, which all made it into English.
Yeah.
And he was highly respected, and he was well read in America. He was published by Grove Press. He was... one of the young Baudrillard's first essays was a great analysis of Johnson's novels on Berlin and how he dealt with the reality of a city where everybody was living in 2 worlds all the time. So no straightforward reality existed.
Yeah.
So there was a great deal of interest in him. And then he just slipped away. In Germany, not at all, of course, because he wrote this monstrously huge 4-volume novel, Anniversaries.
But then he literally... Well, not literally, because it didn't, but he disappeared. And then I knew nothing more about him, and then you find him in Sheerness.
I was astonished. I mean, my experience of that was I read him when I was a student in the University of Kent, which was, it was terrific. It was a brand new university, and it still had this really ambitious humanities curriculum, which was interdisciplinary and the opposite of Oxbridge, and all of it. But the main course was called Britain and the Contemporary World, and it was about taking this old imperial history and plonking it into a new reality and seeing what it looked like. And one of the writers, many writers of the 20th century who were on that course, was Uwe Johnson. So I sort of picked him up there in this new world, which of course hasn't lasted. I mean, the promises of those new universities in the early 70s were big, and by and large they've been ground down to almost nothing. They're like memories. But I found him, and I've always been aware of him because I thought he was a model of the novelist as a political writer. I mean, I know I'm not German. I didn't live in that divided experience. I didn't have to deal with the Nazi legacy that was on all those minds over there. But, I could see that this was somebody using the novel to talk about politics in a way that wasn't just position taking.
Yeah.
It wasn't just telling you the line.
Yeah.
So I've always been fascinated by him. And then I lived in Vancouver later, and then I came across these translations of his huge novel, Anniversaries. And then when I came back, I realised he was living in Sheerness and was finishing the endless novel, Anniversaries, which is now one of the great, great works.
Yeah. See, I suppose I expected a kind of traditional literary biography.
Yeah.
But actually the book is as much about Sheerness,
Yes,
which fascinates me as it is about Uwe Johnson. And I think there you are really explicating this extraordinary relationship between a mentality and a place, that they're constantly kind of refreshing each other in a very tidal way. Yeah.
It was very touching for me because I was, the thing that kept me going on this was this interest in what happens to someone like Johnson, who is this highly successful young man, deeply troubled. I mean, his past he was a disaster for people who cared about him. Terrible stories of disintegration, and he drank too much and all that. But there was this amazing intellectual and sympathetic intelligence in there as well. So you have a man who was formed in the cradle of the best hopes of the early East German state, the anti-Nazi state. We're going to do it differently here. All the Nazis are going to go and live in the West, as many of them did indeed do, and we're going to create a sort of humane new order here. Well, this was snuffed out by the GDR and by all those leaders we know about. And he had to leave. But he still carried that with him, the hopes of Brecht, of Bloch, of the man he studied with Hans Meyer. All of Hans Meyer's parents were extinguished in Auschwitz, and he went back in order to help create a new literature and fought bitterly against the edicts of socialist realism. So Johnson was formed in that world and then ends up in Sheerness. Now, for me, Sheerness is fascinating. It's on this Isle of Sheppey. It's it's an offshore island which is surrounded with sort of mainland contempt and has been for centuries.
Yeah.
It's seen as a sort of terrible dump where people go to fail and to die and to do nothing. And in reality, it's completely fascinating. I mean, what it is a place where, working class London has been able to live in shacks and cabins and own a bit of land, mixed with a big naval and imperial history. So what Johnson does is move to a place that, if you were to ask mainland Kent where the nearest example of the GDR is, they'd point to Sheerness. So he was sort of oddly at home there. And so what I was, and he also then, he said he was going to write a set of stories called Island Stories about what he'd found there. And of course he never wrote it. So I thought, this is my excuse. I'm going to use that question in my mind. What would the island stories be? What might you tell about this place? Yeah. And of course, I can't write like him.
I mean, you quote quite a lot of letters. I mean, including letters to Hannah Arendt.
Yeah. He's sitting on Marine Parade in Sheerness, writing letters to Hannah Arendt, saying, "I wish you were here. I could show you the view." I mean, that's what's going on. Yeah. It is astonishing. And Christa Wolf. I mean, he knows all these highly well-known people, and yet he wants no fame. He wants nothing to do with celebrity or anything. He's just, and in his room he lives in this house overlooking the sea, great big seawall blocking the view for most of the lower floors of the house, and he's got a workroom down below in which he sort of reconstituted the Baltic coast of Germany, Mecklenburg, where he grew up and where he had lived, and he brought all these characters from his novels, and they were as real to him as people. He called them invented persons, not characters. And he had them. Anyone walking on this promenade would just see a morose-looking man not typing at a typewriter. But in his life, this room was full of, it had the whole 20th century of Germany in there. It had all these characters. I mean, it was a teeming, imaginative world. So he found a place to get away to. Yeah. And for me, the story is, it has to be about Sheppey too, because we need to understand places like Sheerness now. Well,
I mean, yes. I mean, you mentioned, and there's quite, fascinating pages and pages about the sociologist Ray Powell.
Yeah, I took a lot out, Ken. I tell you, I could do volume 2 in a week.
I did know Ray because
Ray Powell.
Ray Powell, because he was a friend of Colin Waugh's, who was a great friend of mine.
Yeah.
And I was very taken with Ray Powell's interpretation of what was going on at Sheppey, because there'd been massive deindustrialisation, thousands of jobs lost.
Yeah, I mean, the whole economy was ripped out. Yeah. They closed the naval dockyard in 1960, and it wasn't just thousands of jobs from that. It was thousands of ancillary industries. Yeah. The whole culture of the place was destroyed.
There as well.
Yeah, there's a big steelworks which survived longer later. Yeah. But there were things like the school system, the education system was all structured around apprenticeships. It all disintegrated. Yeah. It couldn't survive without this hub.
So Powell comes along, and I think he stays there for a while. Did he rent
a house? He bought a cheap house. He was quite a good property developer, Ray Powell. Okay. Yeah.
And then he kind of, and this was very convincing to Colin and to me, he then says, well, look, it's not all terrible, because every back garden is full of bits and pieces, old doors, sewing machines, lathes and so on, and people are really kind of doing it for themselves. And he very strongly developed this notion that out there's a new informal economy emerging, that somehow the working class is going to be redeemed through recovering self-help.
No, you're so right. I was so pleased because Ray Powell is the sociologist, Johnson is the writer. They're walking the same streets. They're probably drinking in the same bars occasionally. I shouldn't think Ray Powell drank anything like as much, but he must have visited for sociological reasons occasionally. And they probably never met. But they're exploring exactly the same reality, which is this post-industrial world, and for me, Sheerness was like the pilot project. It's like it was happening elsewhere in England and in Europe at the same time, but Sheppey, because it was an island and because the whole dockyard was such a monopoly, it was a completely dramatic experience of the collapse of industry. And Ray Powell was there, really, he got the work going within about 10 years of that happening, so he was examining the afterlife. And he started off believing, I think he was influenced by people like Marshall Salins and the Stone Age economy argument, that in the Stone Age people only needed to work 20 hours a week and not even that very much. Sometimes in the summer they could just lie about. And I think he thought this was all quite congenial, which of course it is if you've got a salary going into your bank and stuff. But anyway, so he was full of optimism. He thought, look, what's happening is the tyranny of the male job and of the patriarchal household will be released, and women will be free to do a bit more and contribute more to the household economy, and there will be DIY, and the medieval traditions of smuggling will be. He was keen on E.P. Thompson, and we'll bring back a bit of smuggling and a bit of sort of scavenging and poaching and stuff. And of course he got right with this, and he befriended people, and he said, look, don't worry, give up your job if you don't like it. It's going to be all right. And of course, for some of them, it didn't go very well at all. And he got kind of personally stricken by a sense of responsibility for a couple, particularly, who he'd given this sort of advice to. And what happened was that very soon he started writing these papers, and his grim old sort of associates on the left saying, oh, it's no good. This thing you call the informal economy, it's just crime. It's just a black market, isn't it? It's just illegal. Just, terrible. You can't, how can you responsibly say that? People did say those things to him. And he sort of persisted for a bit, but then he realised that all the upcoming, Thatcherite people were getting on board as well.
Institute of Economic Affairs,
Well, it was just what they wanted to hear.
Yeah.
You could rip the heart out of a community, you could destroy the economy and let people pick themselves up and become hippies. So it was a kind of recipe for neglect. So Powell, to give him great credit, saw that, and he turned it into a problem that he owned. And so he went back. And so the first wave, he discovers this thing called the informal economy, as you mentioned. But the second wave, he discovers the underclass. So by the early 80s, both those terms have found their first, I think almost their earliest European application on the Isle of Sheppey. So for me, it was really interesting because I grew up in a sort of middle class world, and I've never had that experience of, I always used to, I was talking to my wife Claire about this. Both of us sort of have a vague memory of envying working class resorts because you'd be taken to them from sort of middle class homes where it's not very proper, a bit too much candy floss around here, that kind of stuff. And you see these kids having just a lot of fun and enjoying the place and not having to worry about all this nonsense. And so, I think what places like, you've got a lot of that on Sheppey. It was, because of the plotland developments, which both Powell and Colin Ward wrote about so well. And, at the time when everyone else was seeing these as shitholes and desecration and environmental vandalism, they were seeing them as like American frontier-style liberty shacks where people could go and run their own lives and not have a fortune in the bank. And that's exactly what they were. So I learned to sort of respect that. And I used Johnsonian perspectives because, I tried to, because he was very interested in similar sorts of things. So I kind of tried to see it through his eyes as well.
That relationship, strangely, between literary influences and notions of self-sufficiency is exactly what happens in, Freighting Hall Farm. About 12 years ago, I was invited to a lunch to meet someone who'd been at the Adelphi Centre, which was a socialist education centre set up by John Middleton Murray and Max Plowman, but actually very much under the influence of the magazine that Murray had set up mostly in 1923 to promote the work of Lawrence. And the magazine was very influential, and it had very, including a lot of writings, essays by Nikolai Berdyaev, Russian anarchist, Christian, so on. And that magazine, I didn't know this at the time, I assumed it was a kind of middle class thing, but by chance, I came across this man called Joe Watson, who had left school at 12, and he was a Geordie, worked at Consett Steelworks, who ran a Shakespeare reading group in Consett, who became an Adelphi enthusiast for the magazine. He worshipped Murray, he worshipped Lawrence, and so when the Adelphi Centre was in trouble, which had been set up in 1936, was trying to be a self-sufficient farm, but couldn't work it. They were coming and going all the time. Murray called down Watson, the only working class person he knew, with this enormous kind of experience. They come and run the Adelphi Centre, and Watson turns up 1941 or something, and realises that they haven't a clue about farming or anything, and he leads a breakaway group to a farm only 10 miles down the road, Freighting Hall Farm. And it's a fascinating story because I hadn't realised just how much those I mean, Watson, as I say, left school at 12. In his 30s and 40s, he was corresponding with Martin Buber. I mean, he was one of a group of miners and steel workers who were avid followers of Lawrence. And that was new to me in the sense I knew, Lawrence was a controversial figure, but, a very important figure. I didn't realise the extent to which after Tolstoy, he really did inspire a whole generation of people to think about this notion of the new life, the life to come, the life. And that's what Freighting Hall Farm really was about. It was to run this farm in ways of delivering the new life. The other thing that I hadn't realised was the scale in the 30s of pacifism. The Peace Pledge Union by 1936, well, when it opened in 1936, by 1939 it had 100,000 members. But also, they saw the only alternative of war was to go back to the land. So pacifism and agrarianism, became combined. And that's where I kind of come across you again, because in this sort of admixture of Lawrence, back to the land, pacifism, how can we live anew?
There's so much to talk about
Dorset.
here.
I mean,
It's
I'm
wonderful.
back to the book you wrote about Dorset.
Yeah, no, it's lovely. I mean, but the first sweet coincidence here is that D.H. Lawrence, this extraordinary figure who people are only now just beginning to reread after the feminist strictures in a way made it sort of almost impossible to think about him. And of course I understand where those came from. But Lawrence's mother grew up in Sheerness.
I know.
Running along, in Sons and Lovers, he describes her running along the seafront. So basically, there are these connections. You're absolutely right. I mean, I thought your Joe Watson man was stunning. He reminded me of a character in my book, Percy Wells, who was the last proper Labour MP that part of Kent had, who had grown up through the sort of horrors of the 20s, who had been a sort of young farm worker, who had organised the farm workers' unions, who had, fought with the mayor of Dover during the general strike. I mean, a properly connected person who was working class, but who also had high aspirations. Yeah. So, if he wanted to read something worth reading. He wasn't going to read some crap novel because some publisher thought it was worth his while. He was going to take... These were serious people who were in that sort of Ruskinian tradition, even if they didn't know they were in it. You use education to raise yourself up, to make yourself capable. And I think these are very interesting figures to think about now, because we're at the... sadly, the Labour Party isn't that force. And maybe it's not exactly its fault that it's drifted so far, because cultures change. But
and a lot of these things are coming back again, particularly around the back to land thing and the soil, because I remember, you deal a lot with Ralph Gardner, who has a very politically ambiguous kind of position.
One of the great things about your book for me was that your Freighting Hall Farm was not an organic movement. No. It avoided all that. They
had to make money.
Yeah, they had to make money, so they had almost battery chickens, let's face it. They probably had them in a field, but they were like those ones they call organic now. They're kind of squeezed up most of the time. But so I think what you've got there is a kind of very interesting, pragmatic agricultural approach connected to Christianity and a sort of non-asserted socialism on the part of the figurehead. Bit of patriarchal leadership. Well, there's plenty of that in Rolf Gardner. And then in Rolf Gardner, you've got this high-born man with Anglo-German ancestral background who's a sort of youth leader who gets off on the German youth movement, the Wandervogel, who thinks they're just terrific. He reveres Lawrence, who writes to him and says, we need a nook of English land to retreat to and start all over again. So he is one of those settlements that Lawrence had in mind.
But then Eliot was the same. Eliot, again, the only hope of the working class was to go back to the land, was to find their roots again.
It's true.
Because they've been deracinated in the city.
I think the difficulty which comes up with the Gardner example is this problem of the organic. Because the trouble with organic theory is if you apply it to human societies, not just to what's in the health food shop, you get into anti-Semitism, you
Yeah.
get into racism, you
Yeah.
get into eugenics
Yeah.
very quickly.
Yeah.
Even today, these
Yeah, yeah,
temptations
yeah,
are
yeah,
absolutely there.
yeah.
And I think the thing that Rolf Gardner did was he sort of struggled with it, but he also partly believed it. So he did see infernal mechanisms everywhere, and
Yeah.
the metaphors were very overripe, and it was the organic is good,
Yeah.
everything else is
Yeah.
bad. Your story is mostly before the establishment of the post-war state.
Absolutely,
And as is
knew
Gardner's.
and they knew it was coming, and they
Yeah.
were worried about it.
And they were worried. So the state what you've got in the earlier period, the 20s and 30s, is a very strong sense of the nation as kind of the land,
Yes.
to the extent that it needs to be a nation at all. And then later you've got the state, which becomes centralizing. And people like Rolf Gardner already objected to the imperialist patter of the accents on the BBC. He was terribly stressed by the fact that the school curriculum was being sort of nationalised, and kids were being educated to leave the land.
Yeah.
Unless you're sick, you've got to go. That was the message schools were relaying.
Yeah.
So he was fighting causes that one can sympathise with, and yet he didn't struggle sufficiently with the problems of being an organic thinker, in my judgment. I mean, it's easy for me to say that, but that was sort of how I concluded.
I mean, I have to be reminding people that Freighting was, at its core, very Christian. There were nonconformists, Anglicans, and Catholics there, but which is why actually, although there's a church at the corner of the farm, all their services were held in the great barn in a kind of ecumenical kind of space. The rituals, the harvest suppers, they had a theatre group. They did kind of T.S. Eliot's, the one about Thomas à Becket.
Yeah.
They did plays. They had a choir. Occasionally, Imogen Holst would turn up to run some choral things. They had visiting musicians. They had a very strong kind of not a ritual cultural life, but it was rooted in a way it was in kind of an Anglican. Musical and artistic and dramatic, because this was a time when people were putting pageants all over the place.
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah.
I mean, it is interesting, and they were doing that, weren't they? And it was a sort of applied version of partly the arts and craft vision, wasn't it?
Yeah.
You can create culture out of your own materials.
And what for me made me absolutely, when I gave this talk at the Essex Book Festival in 2019. I mentioned Freighting Hall Farm because I didn't know anything about it, and I knew something about the Adelphi, but I knew there'd been a breakaway. And there were two elderly women in the audience who came up to me and I said, well, we live on Freighting Hall Farm, would you like to come and see it? And my wife, Lorraine, and I did. And they showed us all these magnificent photographs, and I was completely spellbound. I had to do this. And what also was that all the people I interviewed obviously were children. They are now the same age, in my late 70s, early 80s. But as children, they had a happy time. It was wonderful. Although they were unaware often of the arguments amongst the parents above their heads. But and I would like to read a passage because that so often these places are portrayed as they're destined to fail.
Yeah.
All forms of alternatives.
The other thing I feel is that it's okay for something to be a project, not a permanent institution.
Exactly.
Why do you have to go on forever?
Well, one of Kate Weaver, who was one of the children who I interviewed, at some point I said to her about that, she said, look, it was a work in progress. Life is a work in progress,
Yeah, perfect.
So this was sent to me as a letter by a woman called Mary Duncan in her early 80s. And I've been tracing people who had actually been to the farm, and she'd been there on 5 summers running. And I think it's a lovely kind of description of the kind of happiness that could happen in these places. Okay, for 4 or 5 summers, I cannot exactly remember the dates, during the war and its immediate aftermath, I went to Freighting to help with the harvest. It was a wonderful change from taking a local job at the Ministry of Pensions, which, with the new recruits to the RAF and the predictable crowd of holidaymakers, overran Blackpool in the summer. She was from Blackpool. I suppose the first thing to be said about Freighting was the sense of freedom. It was everything that Blackpool was not: empty, peaceful, pretty. I love the old farmhouse, which in my memory was not very near to any other habitations and conveyed a sense of space everywhere. The days were full of variety, and variety in that context is an aspect of freedom. The The main job was to bring in the harvest, building the sheaves into stooks as they were thrown out of the binder, all this done by hand, of course, in those days. Then, after some days, tossing the sheaves with a pitchfork onto horse-drawn carts. The swing of the pitchfork from ground to cart was very satisfying, especially with oats. Wheat was heavy and barley, though light, was spiky. Briefly, I remember doing a spell of milking by hand and, joy of joys, riding a slow horse to the blacksmith's to be shod. In all this, there was a lot of tomfoolery and sense of working on the harvest field together. I do not remember any serious quarrelling. There were arguments and disagreements about work, say, or at table about belief systems, convictions, or other people. Folk could be trying, even critical, but always interesting. United in their attitude to war, they were free to be themselves in community. We used to get lots of visitors at weekends, mostly from London. I remember clearing out a bar with Shirley Williams. Not quite Williams then, and I remember thinking how pretty she was. My most bewitching memory of the impact of those visitors was on a glorious morning when most people, Saturday though it was, were already at work. I heard the sound of a violin and following it came to the large drawing room, which, having windows on two sides, was filled with sunshine. The place was deserted except for a figure in the centre of the room. It was Jürgen Hess, who later became the leader of the BBC Scottish Orchestra, playing Beethoven, the violin concerto. It was such a beautiful moment. I also remember two sisters, singers, who were regular visitors. I remember the song that one of them sang, though I've never heard it sung again. The sun on my right hand and the moon on the other. The moon is my sister, the sun is my brother. The sun on my left hand and the moon on my right. My brother, good morning. My sister, good night. There were spats and fallouts among us, but in our leisure hours harmony prevailed. We used to sit together in the drawing room, if nothing else was going on, reading our books, George Orwell, Herbert Reed, Reinhold Neubauer, or something lighter. This is rather a rosy account, and, as I own, it was only around in the summer, an incomplete one. But I remember a sense of family, the connectedness of people, which was a fundamental aspect of the community. People who were thoughtful, responsible, caring, often merry, but all of them, as I recall, were serious people, people of conviction and humanity. And that is very much the sense I got from everybody I interviewed, that despite all the problems of this notion of making community, something magical had happened. And I wanted to kind of write this book as a kind of firing across the bows of all those people who say that kind of communitarianism a kind of dead end.
Mm. No, I think it's terrific. I mean, it's like a sort of, it's kind of oddly like an English kibbutz almost, isn't it?
Well, yeah, exactly.
You're on the land. And what I was also interested in was how they marked off the difference between the collective and the personal.
Yes.
Because in a sense what you've got there is, I mean, in the kibbutzes in their heyday, and I was fortunate enough to visit one in 1970, everything was collective. You know, I mean, there was a dining hall where you ate. Children were separated from their parents and collectively looked after in bomb shelters, as it had to be.
Yeah.
But your system is different because, of course, there is the collective good in the sense that there's the land and the farm and the duties that people have to respect and all those. But family life is in the houses, isn't it?
Yeah.
There's no collective food.
No.
You know, it's quite. I mean, there are eating together is a festival. It's not a routine.
Yeah.
You know, so it's very interesting how the differences work.
But also, it had. I mean, it was a self-contained world, a bit like rather a large island. I mean, all the children said, "Well, we never knew where we were going to have supper or tea."
Yeah, I mean, I heard that on Sheppey as well.
We'd just go into other people's houses, and if someone was saying, you know, "We'll come for tea," well, there's 5 of you, that's okay. Bread and jam for 5.
And if a child's wandering around a bit lost, somebody makes a phone call or does whatever. Yeah, that's right.
So there we are. I think.
So how do you avoid that? I mean, one of the things I was teased about when I was writing about Sheppey was, am I just some sort of mad nostalgist in trying to dig all this up? And I thought, my answer to that was no, because these are important memories. And I do think this culture at the moment, well, the whole world's culture at the moment has been rightly very concerned with the Black Lives Matter movement. But I sometimes think that the question of the sort of the kind of more consolidated white world is also needs to be understood and remembered and carried forward, because you need to find potentialities within it where they exist, and you need to find the places where it got it wrong. You know? So I think that inquiry should be more seen as part of the same endeavour. I think it's two sides of one concern that we should have more in common, perhaps a little bit. But I feel that one of the sort of interesting things to me about Sheppey was that it was, you know, I mean, Sheerness feels it was a weird and remote and defeated town. The thing about Sheerness is that we all live there. It's just around the corner for everybody. I mean, we all live in this kind of disconnected world where the sort of something that worked for sort of a long time, for better or worse, is no longer functioning. Yeah. So we're all living in the ruins of, call it the industrial system, call it the sort of agricultural settlement movement. I mean, there are lots of different things that are sort of no longer driving forces, but out of which we have to form our own understanding nonetheless. Yeah. So I think that's the project. That's what we have in common in a way.
And it is paying attention to what is actually going on.
Yeah.
Rather than kind of living on Twitter to see what other people think is going on.
And also the danger of for my sorts of investigations is that you end up looking for certainly when I was working with Rolf Gardner, I had to face this, because initially I was horrified. You know, I mean, the people were telling me he planted Nazi swastikas in the trees, you know, with elms in pine. I don't think he did, but these were the things people who were around when he was around were saying. But what I found myself having to think about now, what am I doing here? I mean, am I just looking for proof that the English countryside is racist? Or am I actually going to be more nuanced about this? Yeah. And I try always to be more nuanced, but, you know, in a sense, you've got to avoid that. The danger is that you will simply apply a judgment from your own time, whether it be positive, appreciative, or highly critical. And so that's part of what makes the investigation so interesting to me, is coming to terms with your own suppositions and allowing them to be changed, and always finding the world more interesting as a result of what you find.
Well, I think we'll end with the notion that, I mean, Edward Thompson was always going on about this. The great problem is the condescension of posterity. We look back and we think people were just silly.
Yeah, and we also don't realise how thoroughly consumerised we are.
When people in the future look back on us, they'll just wonder what the bloody hell was going on.
Yeah. How did they lose that? Yeah. How did they let that happen?
How did they let that happen?
Yeah, it's what I feel that a lot. I feel like I have to apologise to young people.
Exactly. Yeah. Exactly. Thank you.